Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Well, let's get started, folks. Thank you for being here. My name is Rusty Stahl. I'm President and CEO of Fund the People and joined by my colleague, Annie. You want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Annie Chang. I'm with Nonprofit Finance Fund, calling in from Los Angeles. So excited to be here today.
Thank you for being here, Annie. And we've got a fantastic lineup for you today. So welcome to this Fund the People webinar and this live podcast recording for the Fund the People podcast. I want to thank our speakers, Annie, who's going to be speaking and moderating for us today, as well as others we have with us, Kim, Maria, and we've got Janelle as well, and myself. So we've got a lot of folks to hear from today. This conversation is going to be about the concept of staff operating support, which is a new concept that was introduced in November by Fund the People to the field, and we're excited to share it and discuss it today. And I'm going to be kind of presenting on it, and then we have this panel of excellent colleagues who are going to weigh in on the idea and share their perspectives and hopefully some constructive criticism and engage all of you as well in the conversation. This is part of our spring webinar series. So we last month had on Alicia Smith-Arrilaga from the Center for Effective Philanthropy, talking about their research on the mounting pressure facing the nonprofit sector. And next month, we're going to have Vu Lei come on in conversation with myself. So save the date for that. Registration's coming soon. That's April 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So Annie, before we kind of jump into all of the content today, I know you and the Nonprofit Finance Fund have been working closely with nonprofit leaders and funders through your financial consulting and advocacy work. And for folks who don't know Nonprofit Finance Fund, you should certainly get to know them. They're a fantastic nonprofit advisory institution that helps nonprofits with their finances. And I've been a beneficiary of trainings and resources that NFF has provided. And Annie is their VP of Community Engagement out of the LA office. So what are you seeing right now through that consulting and advocacy work when it comes to staffing pressures and financial sustainability issues?
Thanks, Rusty. And thanks, everyone, for joining in. I even see Falashade calling in from Philadelphia. It's really great to see different partners across the country calling in. And the speakers lined up today, I'm so excited to hear from them, Rusty, because I think they're going to be able to share firsthand what they are having successes with, and then what are those challenges, and how does something like staff operating support grants fit into that. So it's going to be some really great lived experience here on the call too. I will say for Nonprofit Finance Fund, we are a national community development financial institution focused specifically on supporting nonprofit organizations, both with our lending, our consulting, and our advocacy work. Today, it's really focused on just the messages and the insights and things that we're hearing from nonprofit leaders on the ground, from funders on the ground, from the advocates that are trying to really create a better system for how we serve and really support communities. And our most recent nonprofit state of the sector survey that NFF did last year showed a very challenging picture, which we are starting to live out now coming into 2026. Last year, we saw that nonprofit leaders were really dealing with a mix of 3 crises that were predominantly heavy with them in how they are doing their work and running their organizations. 86% saw the impact of inflation, and that's just really with costs going up and maybe their revenue and their grants not going up alongside that. But they were really feeling the cost pressures that other businesses in this country feel right now, and other families do as well. 84% saw a decrease. We're expecting a decrease in funding, in their government funding, due to the impact of the election. And this was a survey that was conducted in Q1, just shortly after the executive order started dropping in January. And then we know that a lot of those cuts came to fruition throughout the year, and we're expecting more of them in this next cycle of federal funding, passing down into local entities, and those maybe who don't even have direct federal grants are going to feel that in how funding flows to their organizations. And 85% of the organizations in the survey were feeling an increase in demand from the communities that they're serving. And we know that's even going to be more true now as we're seeing that many of the regulations that are really holding back what services folks can access, that service demand pressure is going to be felt even more by nonprofits on the ground. And those are all just about getting the programs and services into communities. And then when we zoom in on the staff that it's doing this work, the leaders that are carrying this, that are having to manage and care for and make sure their staff can be there for the communities that are experiencing these pressures. I mean, I think that's why your whole podcast and Fund the People exists, is to really focus on those that are frontline doing this work in this environment. What we found was that 41% of those who took our survey, only 41% were able to pay all of their staff a living wage. So we're talking about less than half the sector that can pay all the staff in their nonprofit business a living wage, which is not even a thriving wage, right? So we're really feeling the pressures of what staff are experiencing, maybe even being on the brink of being eligible for the services that their organization might be providing. And we want to stop the cycle. We want to stop this continued constraints that staff feel in being able to live their own lives while working for an organization, supporting the lives of those in their community. And only 67% of our survey respondents were able to provide health insurance to their staff. And I've been asked this since we've been sharing these findings. We don't know how much of health insurance those organizations are able to provide either. I was just on a call yesterday where an executive director was sharing that she's actually had to increase how much she can cover because her staff weren't actually taking advantage of their health insurance benefits. So I think this is why we're having this conversation today and looking for solutions. We do have a report that just dropped last week for folks who haven't checked it out, that was graciously funded by the Walter and Louise Haas Fund and the Irvine Foundation, that really lies out actual strategies, things that folks are doing. And I think what you're offering, Rusty, is something we can do going forward. And we want to explore that in the conversation with the panelists, leaders that are providing well-being days for their staff, folks that are offering sabbaticals for long-term staff that are leaders that are burnt out, the funders that are funding those things, the funders that are calling in and checking on their staff to say, how's your organization doing right now in the face of your community facing ICE raids? Those things that all contribute to well-being. And there's some really great practices in that report. I encourage folks to check that out. But I want to hand it back to you, Rusty, to be able to really center us on one opportunity to be able to support the sector.
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, I mean, very stark findings, and thank you for sharing just some of them.
And
Thanks.
we mentioned the S.O.S grants as well as just things that folks are doing on the ground to be able to really take action right now.
Oh, great. Thank you for that. You know, as you were talking, Annie, it reminded me of, I don't know if folks listening here have seen this, but there's this study that Independent Sector and United Way did together called ALICE in the Nonprofit Workforce, which is about, ALICE is basically working poor, people who are working but having challenges staying above the poverty line. And United Way looked at that just in the economy in general or in the country in general. And then they did the study of what that looked like in the nonprofit sector itself. And I think it was 20% of the nonprofit workforce is hovering around the poverty line. And within that 20%, I believe 5% was below the poverty line. So 5% of nonprofit workforce working in nonprofits below the poverty line. And then another 15% hovering at the poverty line, which we know the poverty line hasn't been updated in decades and is fairly low, as I imagine, as inflation continues to go up. So yes, there are a lot of nonprofit people with master's degrees who are living in cars or working 3 jobs and things like that, or are eligible for the services of their organization. So it's a really serious issue. So thank you for sharing Nonprofit Finance Fund's work. I think you set me up very well. And so I'll present, and then Annie will take over the airwaves again and have our panelists weigh in. So that's kind of the agenda for the day. And I hope we'll have time for folks who have questions or thoughts. Okay, so my presentation echoes the name of the webinar here, Exploring S.O.S Staff Operating Support. My agenda for this presentation for you, I'll give a smidge of context about where this all came from, talk about the compounding crisis happening, talk about why current types of grants are inadequate to address the crisis, define staff operating support for you, offer 7 key traits of staff operating support, and then my call to action that it's an all hands on deck time. So context for this work, for those of you who are tuning in to Fund the People for the first time here, our mission is to maximize investment in America's nonprofit workforce, and our programs and activities all aim to provide transformative ideas and practical tools to help everyone invest in nonprofit workers, whether you are a nonprofit worker and you need to invest in yourself, or if you're an executive director, a fundraiser, a grant maker, a policymaker, a regulator, wherever you may sit in the sector or outside of it. Our framework is called Funding That Works, and it kind of grew organically from tools we were building, from journal articles that we had published, and during the pandemic, when kind of speaking opportunities dried up, I took the opportunity to try to create a cohesive intellectual architecture for all these different ideas and to make it all hang together. And so that became what we call Funding That Works. And we are in the process of redesigning our website, and Funding That Works, the framework, will be really centrally available there soon with the new site. And staff operating support is kind of the latest idea to be added to the framework. So you'll get a flavor of the framework as I talk. Fund the People is fiscally sponsored by community partners in LA. Shout out to community partners. And supported by funders including the James Irvine Foundation, the Barr Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Raymond John Ween Foundation, and others, and individual supporters as well. So thanks to all of you who are supporting our work. Okay, so now on to the dark stuff. We're facing what I'm calling a compound crisis, because it's a new kind of crisis. And I'll talk about why it's compounding in a second. But we are in a moment where, as you kind of heard from Annie a bit, this is more significant, structural, sector-wide, and sustained than most of the crises we've faced, at least certainly in my lifetime, and I think in a really long time. And it's more serious, I think, than many funders or others have really imagined. And so I think to survive and thrive, nonprofits need a new kind of funding that is also significant, also structural, also long-term. And so that's what we hope to contribute to happening. So why is this crisis compounding? Because we have a chronic crisis beneath recent crises, beneath our current crisis. And the old crises didn't go away when the new crises showed up. They're all layered on top of each other. Most of you listening, this is not news to you. So the chronic crisis I define as the chronic lack of investment, deficit of investment in America's nonprofit workforce, that ever since this country has existed, and even before it, the nonprofit sector or its antecedents, civil society in whatever form it took, had people working in it for pay, voluntary, and those people have been left out, made invisible, exploited, and that certainly happened here. So just quick examples. In the New Deal, the charity workers were not included in things like Social Security benefits because I guess they weren't considered real workers or people in need of old age assistance. When the pandemic hit, nonprofits were almost left out of PPP loans as employers with a payroll to maintain. And it was only because of the National Council of Nonprofits and others advocating to make sure that nonprofits were actually added to that legislation, included as employers in our country, even though nonprofits employ 10% of the private workforce. So there's a policy dimension to this underinvestment, and things like the overhead myth are propagated and reinforced by policy. For example, in the 990 form that nonprofits have to fill out. It also comes from within the sector, from funders who echo that overhead myth, the indirect costs concept of basically saying we only want to fund programs, we don't want to fund salaries or leadership costs or fundraising costs or all those other things, sort of dismissing nonprofit people. That culture gets embedded then into nonprofits and into fundraising. So the underinvestment comes from all directions. So that's kind of the chronic crisis. The recent crisis we've all lived through, or at least most of us have, when you could include the pandemic, you could include the racial uprising period and the backlash to racial justice. You could include the political crisis that started in 2016, other elements that nonprofits and their workers have been living through and working through. And then the current crisis. In this last year and a half, we've had a real intentional and well-executed war on the nonprofit sector and philanthropy from our own federal government. And that is more than just the funding cuts, which the funding cuts would be enough, but it's also included propaganda, congressional hearings, threats of investigations, and a lot of other things. In fact, right now, even as the government is waging a real war, the administration is attacking nonprofits again with an effort to make nonprofits sign a legal certification that they will comply with the immigration and anti-DEI policies and perspective of the administration in order to get federal funding. So there's a sign-on letter against that and a period of public comment that organizations can sign on to now through the end of March. So make sure you check out the National Council of Nonprofits to find out about that. So those are the compounding crises that we face. And I want to argue that our current types of grants that we have are inadequate to address these issues. Capital funding is mostly for buildings, not people, setting aside professors who get endowed chairs. Restricted project support is antithetical. It actually is oppositional to investing in nonprofit salaries, benefits, HR systems, and decent working conditions. Capacity building support is mostly supplementary to existing grantees and is small and really usually project focused. It doesn't change the game in terms of budgets, salaries, benefits, anything like that, by and large. These are all generalizations, by the way. And general operating support, I think this is provocative, but general operating support gets used to fund existing costs that haven't been funded yet, fill in gaps while waiting for government money to arrive, or launch new programs. And so there's still that pressure. The incentive to invest in the nonprofit workforce is not there in general operating support, even though everyone wants it. So we think we need to remix those factors, those kinds of grants, to create staff operating support. So the idea of staff operating support is it's a funding vehicle that funders and fundraisers can use to create the incentives and the money that empowers nonprofits to systematically invest in their workforce. Here are the 7 key traits that I laid out in our article in the Nonprofit Quarterly. First, staff operating support is restricted. It's restricted to investments in the grantee organization's workforce. That could be employees, but that could also be contractors or volunteers who need support of some kind or another. And the idea is that this money is for that. But it's also trust-based and flexible and responsive and malleable. So within the restricted zone of investing in the employees, and which, frankly, is the largest part of most nonprofit budgets, is salary, benefits, and contracts. So you're really not limiting it that much. You're limiting it to the majority of the budget. And so within that restricted zone, organization grantees can use it as needed and change that as needed. 3, it's the primary grant. It's not supplementary. It's not a mini grant for well-being activities in one moment. It's meant to invest in systems like recruitment, retention, HR, salaries, benefits. And so it needs to be the primary grant, not a minor secondary kind of supplemental grant. 4th, it's money, not programming. So often when funders do invest in leadership development in their grantee population or in the sector, it ends up being an award, a fellowship, a cohort. It's a program. It doesn't add or change grantee or nonprofit budgets. It doesn't change the incentive for investing in staff. 5th, good boundaries can mitigate fear and power dynamics. So grantees don't need to tell their funders all the dirty laundry about burnout or whatever, or underpay, just to get an S.O.S. grant. And funders don't need to stick their nose where they don't want to. They can still support S.O.S. funding without micromanaging grantees. So having good boundaries is important. Document and share. There's very little data about the return on investment of investing in nonprofit people. So the more that funders and nonprofits are willing to share about what they do and how valuable it is or isn't, the more information and education is possible in the sector. And 7th, consent is essential. So this is not something that should be imposed upon nonprofits, and nonprofits can't really force funders to do this. It's got to be agreed upon. So it is an all hands on deck moment or era. To save our sector, we need to save our staff. And to save our staff, I believe, need staff operating support. So as you can see in this image, we've taken the colors of those 4 existing types of grants and integrated them together. So with restriction instead of being opposed to staffing costs, actually incentivize funding, spending on staffing costs. Instead of using the unrestricted broadly, it's unrestricted within that zone. And that will support capacity and programs. And so if you want to learn more about the ideas, you can find all the resources on this slide at this new page on our site, fundthepeople.org/SOS grants. That's where I'll leave it.
Rusty asked us to be honest and to put everything out there. Can't wait for this panel to discuss, but I always appreciate conversations, Rusty, because it's really exploring new dynamics of things that we have said, should be how the sector is funded. And I think this idea of a restricted grant for staff is an unconventional thing to think about. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel, really looking forward specifically from Janelle, who leads an organization who's frontline having to manage those restrictions on how something like this sits. I will say for NFF, we are a very big believer in trust-based philanthropy, in funders really building relationships with their grantees that are based on trust, where we can explore different things and that funders can show up and in their practice not say things or indicate things that make an organization shy away from sharing what's honestly happening. And I think that's often hard. And we'll explore those dynamics more with this panel too. And a wonderful panel to hear from Kim and Maria, who are on the front lines of meeting their grantees where they are and building that trust. So we have Kim Almeida, Director of Programs from the Levi Strauss Foundation. We have Maria Cabildo, who I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, CEO of the Durfee Foundation. We have Janelle Miller-Moravec, the Executive Director of Youth and Family Counseling. And I just want to open it up to you all, whoever wants to go first and kind of reflecting from what Rusty shared. There's unconventional things in what NFF has talked about. So I'm really curious from where you all sit, what resonates with you? What are things that maybe you're trying to process right now? How would this actually work and be supportive?
I'd like to just jump in first. I really appreciate, Rusty, the all hands on deck moment, because last year I was invited to speak at Southern California Grantmakers at the CEO Roundtable. And one of the things I said is, we have a COVID type moment right now that requires everybody to jump in and have conversations and respond. And I don't see it. And I said, well, maybe it's because I'm a small family foundation and I don't get invited to the big boy table. But I really do feel like there's not the energy that we had during COVID. So, Rusty, I really appreciate you saying this is all hands on deck. And regardless of how you may feel about SOS, this requires our attention. The other piece is, I think about the policy wins, right? As funders, we want to fund the exciting campaign. And the lack of something like SOS means that after we win a campaign, no one has the resources to implement because that's the boring part. Nobody wants to get in and the regulations and the attending every council meeting and every supervisor's meeting to make sure it's happening because the funder wants to fund the next campaign. And I feel like something like an SOS gets you to funding what's really needed to change structures. And right now we have a system of funding and relationships where funders, we just want to fund the exciting new thing. And I think SOS gets us to making long-term commitments and allowing nonprofits to make the decisions that they need to make. I'm thinking of like movement organizations in particular, but I'm sure that's applicable to all nonprofits, right? So that's what really struck me right now, which is actually different from what I thought I would say based on my notes.
Definitely get back to you, Maria, on some of the things we know you want to mention too. But Janelle and Kim, other reflections as you just hear the layout of SOS grants?
Yeah, as someone whose staff and we work and we fill out grant applications and we have to write down the salaries and the benefits and we're calculating our fringe and then we have to explain why we didn't spend that. Well, that person left and we hired someone at a different salary level. It's a lot. And I love this idea. I know that when I take care of my people, that then they can do their jobs and succeed. I think we need to pay attention and make this even easier for both nonprofits and for funders. I guess it's an ask that I have of Rusty and the rest of the powers that be is take this to the accountants, because at the end of the day, they decide they decide the rules of how we reflect our financials to the rest of the world. On the one hand, I don't like restricted dollars because that means that I have to have my accounting team count them a certain way, and then they have to be released based on spending, but also unrestricted dollars. It's really hard for the donors and the funders to see the impact and to raise the visibility of the workforce and the amazing need that we have. So I think it's an ask to loop in our accounting partner friends.
I appreciate that so much, Janelle. And I think that dynamic right there between unrestricted, restricted is what I see in this, Rusty, on the S.O.S. is like, well, what is the balance around that of giving you enough direction and funders enough understanding of what their funds are supporting, while also you enough flexibility. And I think this opportunity to visit how it actually would work and would reflect in how someone actually makes a decision and runs the organization like you, Janelle, is really important. Kim, I want to give you a chance to come into the conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone that spoke. And I'm like Maria, I have notes, but I'm just going to kind of riff off of what I'm hearing because other things are coming up. I think for me, where I sit with the Levi Strauss Foundation is that most of my background in grant making has been on the international side and specifically looking at apparel workers in factories around the world that make the Levi's products, but really just generally speaking, looking at the apparel sector globally. And this issue of underinvestment in people is pervasive, right? It is, I think my first observation is what the US is talking about right now and what Rusty's bringing to the forefront is something that honestly it exists everywhere. And it's the secret sauce behind every supply chain and every item that we buy, right? The reason we can buy stuff from Amazon is because someone is getting exploited behind the scenes, right? So this issue of how we treat our workforce and how we invest in the workforce is something that I've been thinking about most of my career. And interestingly, we've done a lot of research at the Levi Strauss Foundation with the Harvard School of Public Health. And we've really understood that when you invest in people, in the workplace, it has a ripple effect in life. It's actually a causal relationship that if you treat people well at work, they will thrive in life. So there's such an exponential benefit for actually treating people well. It definitely improves the retention rates and the overall happiness and engagement and satisfaction at work, but it also has this ripple effect on their communities and families. And why wouldn't we want that for our movement leaders, right? So I think that's the first piece is that there's a lot of evidence already in the global space that can be applied to what we're thinking about in the US now. And I think the other piece that Rusty mentioned that I think is really important to highlight is that sort of taking a programmatic approach or solution to these endemic root cause issues isn't going to solve it, right? And I think oftentimes the example that Rusty and I were talking about in our last conversation is just, in apparel factories, we see a lot of well-meaning companies and brands and factory owners investing in programs like financial literacy. But if at the end of the day, people aren't making a living wage, it doesn't matter how much you train them on financial literacy. They're not budgeting because they don't have a budget to budget with, right? So the issue here is that we're not paying people adequately. So really being able to name that and saying, what are the root causes here? And how are we expecting as funders, any of these nonprofits to reach the goals and the targets and the ambitions that we've set out for social movements if we're not actually investing in them? So I think that's sort of the case that we're trying to make internally. And we have a board that is very much a long-term thinking board, strategic board that sees that. I think for me, the real challenge now is sort of wrapping this back up into our learning and evaluation framework, right? Because ultimately, if we are in issue areas, and that's the reality of a lot of funders, is saying, okay, well, if we're investing in democracy, how can we tie these issues of investing in the long term beyond just general operating support back to meeting and getting closer to the goals that we've set for ourselves in the democracy space, right? So that's an exercise that I'm thinking about now is how do we integrate this into our learning framework and ask the right questions to be able to tie this back to a framework that our board of directors is already familiar with and they're already bought into.
Thank you so much, Kim, for tying that and just the global perspective also, because I think that's very felt and nonprofits want to be seen as we are staff and we are offering something and creating something that is of value, the same way as many of those workers around the world are also. I think it's a perfect entree for Janelle to share about the wonderful program outcomes that I've only been able to read about, Janelle, around this wonderful gift that your organization was able to receive and start to map out for funders on the call. What does it look like? How does that actually affect program outcomes and that ultimate community impact that a lot of them are looking for?
Yeah, we've done it. I have the data. It works. And I had the opportunity to test it out a couple of years ago. To give context, my organization is an outpatient counseling center. So we're a blend of private practice and community health. And we are people. That is our budget. And we need really skilled people because we see clients of all ages and from all walks of life. So I need a clinical team that can pivot quickly and is really talented and skilled. I need really great back office workers because we're billing commercial insurance and Medicaid. So we're people, right? And that's all we do. It's really hard, though, to keep pace with the economy right now, especially in behavioral health, where there's a shortage of workers. And in COVID, we saw salaries just shoot through the roof. I mean, I've never seen behavioral health salaries like that. I was so happy for all of the workers, but not for me, because what that meant was that YFC as an organization was quickly outpaced in the market. And we got to a point where we could no longer keep our employees. They would leave very quickly. They just couldn't afford to work for my organization anymore. And so it became this revolving door, and turnover kills organizations. And I knew that had to stop. The board knew, we knew what had to be done. We had to raise salaries. We can talk all we want about engaging cultures and growth paths, but you have to have enough money to live. And our folks just couldn't afford to work with us anymore. Well, in the middle of this conversation and putting together a budget, a donor asked to meet with me and my development director. Her name is Melissa. And they sat down with us and they knew about us. And they said, well, we want to make a really big transformational gift. And so what would really move the needle? And Melissa and I came back with salaries. We know we need to pay each person about $10,000 more each year to get to a living wage, not a thriving wage, a living wage. And the donors were like, oh, that's not what we expected. We thought you were going to say, hire another person, acquire this thing. We didn't think you were going to say salaries. But Melissa, who was a compensation analyst in a previous life, walked this really savvy donor couple through our logic and said, here's what we think. Here's why we think this is going to matter. And they said, okay, we trust you. We believe in this. Let's give it a try. And we know something has to change. And you're the experts in YFC, so we'll back you up. And so they gave us a 6-figure gift. And it was over 2 years. And that was enough to raise our core salaries up to that market level. And that was really transformational. It took a minute for us to see the impact, but within 6 months, all of our clinicians were paid at the new salary scales. We said they had to prove that you can do this work, and then we'll put you on this new salary scale. So it was a shared agreement, but they were all on it by the time we got to the end of Q2, so July 1st. And then what was really exciting was watching the clinical outcomes go up. So we have a monthly dashboard, and we look at every month, every quarter. Well, more clients are completing treatment. 95% of clients are completing treatment at YFC, which is really amazing. So when we take care of our people and we allow them to be successful and feel successful, they do good work. And we know that good work translates into good outcomes. And so not just completing treatment, but we're watching the symptoms go down. We're watching more and more clients reach their treatment goals. And at the end of the day, that's what unites all of us here at YFC, is helping people thrive. That's our mission, right? Opening doors to mental health care so people can cope, heal, and thrive, and paying people what they need to afford to work at YFC made all the difference. So I think it works. I'm a firm believer.
That's so beautiful, Janelle, and kudos to the donor that came to you as someone and trusted you as a leader to understand what your organization needed. And I do think rooting that relationship in that is ultimately very helpful. If what you need is staff, or what you need is a new technology system, that they trust you around that. And I think to the point of how do funders know they're ultimately affecting what the area they want to affect in is measure what that organization's doing versus having a specific report of the measurements you want. But clearly there was trust in what your organization was doing and they believed in that.
Yes.
I want to turn to Maria because Maria, I think you are on the ground with the Durfee Foundation doing that. So thankful. I know many of the LA leaders that have benefited from the sabbatical program. I think the Lark Award is highlighted in our report as well. And just the focus that the foundation has on well-being for leaders and staff of nonprofits. And just curious, as you think about this dynamic of what Rusty's offering and restricting staff support, but also you being a leader very deep in trust-based philanthropic practices, how do those go together? And how have you seen that ability to really support staff, this opportunity to maybe support staff specifically balanced with, do they need a restriction on that? Is general operating support something that can get there? What's the pros and cons there for you?
I was thinking about this question because I was like, gosh, what is the connection? Like, how do they interact? The way that I see them right now is the trust-based philanthropy movement it took such a mind shift. So we had this like mental model. Janelle, when you were describing the level of documentation, I got stressed out. Like the amount of reporting, I was just like, oh my God, I can't even imagine what that's like. And I remember when the beauty of the Durfee Foundation, I'm a former sabbatical recipient when I was an executive director back in 2003. And when I asked them what the report was, they were like, oh, just tell us what you did. And I'm like, oh, what? You're like, don't you want to know how I use the resources you gave me for my sabbatical? They're like, no, just write us a couple of notes about what you did and how you felt. And that's still what we do. And we're actually moving to make things simpler. Let's just have a conversation. You don't even have to write anything. Let us take the notes. So I think in some ways, the way that there was a whole mental model shift around trust-based philanthropy, the same thing has to happen with S.O.S. because I think it's connected to trust-based philanthropy, but it is different because this idea of restriction. That's why I really appreciate, Rusty, that you included the idea of consent as one of these things. It's like people need to agree. And I think that the trust piece is just so huge, though, even like to move towards S.O.S. because it is hard. And I know, I mean, I was in Janelle's shoes for 15 years as a CEO, and I didn't think I could really share what was going on in my organization or the challenges. It was hard. I don't think I ever went to anybody and shared like during the Great Recession, like what it meant. Like we figured that all out internally. So I think with the S.O.S. and trust-based philanthropy, it's like, I think you just can't spring it on your grantee. I mean, you really need to have done a lot of cultivation of relationship before you get there. One of the other pieces here that I feel is connected to S.O.S., at least in Los Angeles, we've seen such an increase in unionization. In the nonprofits that are paying some of the lowest wages, right? A lot of the workers in the homeless services sector that for a while have been making just like a little bit above minimum wage. Those big service providers going through unionization. And I feel like even those conversations end up eroding so much trust at multiple levels, like internally with funders. So I just see all these layers, and I'm a big advocate for trust-based philanthropy. I know there are like different scales of it, but I think being able to build those deep relationships and have these honest conversations with funders. And I think that as funders, we need to let go of these mental models, which I've already mentioned, which is like going after the flavor of the day and then just staying with people for the long haul. I'm new to family philanthropy. It is different from other types of philanthropy. And I met a funder whose commitment to their nonprofits was like 10 to 15 years. And I was like, wow, to just say, I'm in there with you for that long. And so I'd love to see like the S.O.S. concept also mean like, we're in it with you for the long haul.
It's beautiful. I think just that focus on trust, Maria, and commitment to the ultimate goals. If as a funder, you're really committed to the change, we know it's not going to happen in 2-year grant cycle, a 3-year grant cycle. If you're really committed to the shared goal that you have with your grantees. And I think the opportunity for S.O.S. to be one of the tools in the toolkit, Rusty asked me to speak about from out of the things that we've seen, how this would fit in. And I think, Rusty, for us, it's a tool. And I think unionization, again, is another tool. So in the report that I dropped, there's some more case studies of organizations and the pros and cons that came with that. But what was really heard was that when it comes to a point of wanting to unionize, it means staff are very unhappy. There's something that is really broken, right? I think the same thing in the labor sector generally, Kim, right? Like it means that there's needs that are unmet and they need to bind together to be able to address that for leaders and their organizations, but also with their funders to address what's that piece that's causing this.
Yeah, so I just like one little anecdote. My son works at a nonprofit in San Francisco that's unionized. And he always asks me, like, Mom, what's the point? What is it? And he just got like a $2 an hour raise. And I'm like, Mijo, that's your union got you that raise. Maybe I don't have to help you with your rent anymore. But, I obviously still do because he works at a nonprofit. But I just wanted to share that silly anecdote.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing the sector, to your point, Rusty, of this being a moment. New strategies are coming into the nonprofit sector that maybe wouldn't have been here 20 years ago. And S.O.S. maybe being one of those tools. I think my encouragement out of this and the full cost work that NFF does is for the opportunity for funders to listen to the grantees, listen to their partners, and what is it you need? You have a board member who's concerned that you're spending too much on staff. How can I help you as a funder? How can I use my role in this? Maybe that is the S.O.S. grant. If your board, your staff, everyone's good on what needs to be done, the unrestricted grant will work because you're ready to put that to use to meet your staff's needs. But without that refined understanding, we always say, you see one nonprofit, you've only seen one nonprofit. You can't assume that what's going to work here is going to work everywhere, which I think we're seeing in the chat also. And I think for funders to understand how they can meet those needs, I'm going to turn to you in a second, Kim, to bring you back into this conversation of, as a funder, trying to understand how can we make shifts to be able to be there and understand maybe some of the things our organizations aren't telling us, our grantees aren't telling us. How do we open that up? How do we become their partner so that they don't have staff that are on the brink of being eligible for their services? And I know that you've been doing some thinking with Rusty too, but Kim, anything that comes up for you and how you all are thinking internally too?
I would say, to underscore this element of trust, I would say even at the nonprofit level, we know from all of the research and the case studies that have been mentioned here that having a culture of trust, respect, and fairness at the workplace is really essential, right? That's what's going to lead to good outcomes and good work. So I think the trust has to start in the culture itself of the nonprofit organization, and then it extends into relations with donors. So I think that the trust-based model is great, and it focuses so much on the relationship between donors and nonprofits. I'd like it to also be thinking about the nonprofit culture itself, right? Like it has to start there. And that is when you talk about trust, respect, and fairness at the workplace, being treated fairly is being paid adequately, a living wage or a thriving wage, right? I think oftentimes what I see is that things get hidden in the shadows and we have so much jargon to say things that make things sound differently. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is decent wages, right? I think what I'm trying to do with my team is really get into the practice of just actually saying what we mean. So in conversations with grantees, just saying it, are you paying a living wage? And it's not coming from a place of accusation. It's coming from a place of trust and of just understanding the issues that our nonprofit partners are facing. So not being patronizing, but rather just asking the questions that oftentimes we've been afraid to ask, right? It opens up that door to having a deeper conversation around not just the leadership of the nonprofit, but your workforce, right? I would say as a first step, we've just started to inquire about operating support or operating costs of nonprofits across the board just by inserting questions into our due diligence process. We also no longer require interim reports. So in mid-grant check-ins, just asking about that, like how has inflation affected your ability to operate, right? Are costs going up? Tell us a little bit more about that, right? And really asking it from a place of learning as opposed to having all the solutions, because certainly we're not a big enough funder to be able to cover all the costs, but at least we can start to bring those insights back into our team and educate our staff and also our board on these issues. So I would say we're early in the journey. We're in conversation with Rusty and the team to figure out, okay, how do we start to operationalize some of this? And I think for me, it really is starting with inserting those questions, making them part of our process and the discipline of how we assess an organization's ability to make progress towards our goals, and actually making that part of our grant recommendation of being honest and saying, actually, this organization is having a really hard time with just covering operating costs. So our expectations are going to be a little bit lower. We know it's an important organization in the ecosystem. We want to continue working with them, but we also realize and acknowledge that what they may be able to achieve might be less than what they have in past years just because of this given reality. So I think just being able to say what hasn't been said before is a first step for us. And I would actually apply that at the global level too, kind of coming back to this is an issue here, but the foreign funding landscape, as many of you know from USAID cuts, I mean, this is being exponentially felt across the world, right? So the same practices that we're using here, really taking those outside of the US and also learning from our partners outside of the US, like the women's funds and feminist funds around the world. They've been facing this type of challenge for decades, right? So really listening to how they've approached it. And many of these women's funds do make restricted operating support grants to their network of grantees because these small organizations will always invest in programs over staff, and really changing that mindset of saying it's okay to invest in your own staff.
I love the thoughtfulness of all of this. I think there's folks asking for the questions that you ask, and something that we always offer is to sit in the other person's shoes. And I think that's what you all are trying to do. As a nonprofit leader, having to answer questions, it's like a constant decision. If I say this, is this going to make this funder run? If I say this, are they going to understand my needs and fund me more? And I think funders not doing the practices afterwards that create that cycle of not sharing, because I shared something and now you're not funding me afterwards. And I think that's the delicate balance, that dance in that relationship.
Many of us as nonprofit leaders, a portion of our budget has to be made up from philanthropy. That means that need for philanthropic funding will we're always going to need donors. And our best relationships are those 10, 20-year relationships where we see the growth. I mean, that steady investment is what allows for innovation and allows that space to think about, what do I do now? What do I do next? And I also think that, like all relationships, there's level 1 conversations, but as you get to know, then there's level 2, there's level 3. And hopefully by the time you get to level 3, you can share struggles, and as many of you have said, funders have amazing resources as well. Sometimes you go to conferences that we don't have access to, and you might be a really good resource. I might say, have you seen someone do this really well? How are other people responding to this? And I'm hearing that a lot right now as we're trying to figure out how we're going to replace Medicaid income. We're all just scrambling. So how can we work together? And I think that's the beauty of where you have these really good relationships between funders and organizations is, at the end of the day, how do we take care of the people, both at the organizations and in the community? We need to be really creative.
Yes, definitely. The other resources that funders can bring to support staff beyond just the dollars too. I think that's really important to highlight for those on the phone. A lot of great chat here. And I think this opportunity, what I really heard from Kim and Maria is the opportunity to really lessen the burden for your grantees and replacing that long report or the online report with all the fields with the conversation. I mean, I think if there's any organizations on the call, they're like, yes, that is what I want. Can I just verbally tell you? Can you take the note? I think I heard one of you say that we'll take the notes. We will put it into our system for you. And that's an easy, very easy thing. That's very stressful for organizations that are trying to perfect that report. Janelle, I think, of exactly how do we say what we need to say about what we achieved. And hopefully we don't say it wrong. But in a conversation on the phone, we can talk about that. And just want to offer that, as I know that there's some things about more efficiencies. The ultimate efficiency, I think, is when funders say, let's have a call about that. But any experiences, Janelle and Maria and Kim, to bring into that too?
I want to give other folks a chance to chime in too, but it's a lot of work too to understand funders are like people. You have your individual funding priorities, and when we work together, it's because something has aligned. And so keeping all of those, this one likes this, and this one's worried about this. And there's not one standard application. Every application is a little bit different. So that's just more challenges on leadership when we're securing philanthropy.
Yeah, Janelle, I totally hear you on that. We fund organizations for very specific areas of their work. And what we've tried to do is just be really transparent and direct about it and just say, we know you do all this work, but these are the 2 things that we're really funding you to do. And we understand that it's general operating support grants, so you're going to do it all, right? But what we really care about is conversations on these 2 areas and just naming it, right? Just saying it and taking away the mystery of it so no one's trying to guess. I think the other thing that has been really, I believe, based on feedback from our grantees that has been well received is that Levi Strauss Foundation is a corporate foundation. So we've tapped into the resources that the company has and said, okay, well, we aren't going to ever be able to give away millions and millions of dollars because we just don't have that budget. But what we do have is access to experts inside of the company that may be able to offer expertise to nonprofits on specific issues like AI, like business continuity, like crisis management. How do you communicate and how do you manage a crisis unfolding in 24-hour cycles? Because businesses are really good at doing that, and we have a lot of internal talent that is specialized in that. So what we started offering last year was a series of webinars with internal experts to talk to our nonprofit partners. And it was astounding how many people signed up for it. It was really well received. So we're planning another series of that this year, even like on employment law, right? Levi's employs tens of thousands of people around the world. We have a lot of folks that are very, very specialized and knowledgeable on specific topics that might be of use to our grantee network. So really thinking kind of creatively about what else we can do to offer resources to grantees.
That's a really cool example, Kim, that I wouldn't have thought of. Maria, yes.
Yeah, so I think the thing I wanted to add was one of our grants, and you mentioned the LARC program, which is our program that is dedicated to collective care. And it's a $30,000 grant for small profits with budgets of under $2 million. And in reading the applications, Annie, one of the things that you raised, when we asked people to say, like, how do you see yourself potentially using the funds? We've actually had applicants that are like, we'd like to have health insurance for the year. So one of the things that we've observed in the applications is that people need permission to take care of themselves on their own. We've had grantees that have had line items in their budget for staff wellness and don't touch it because they have no idea what to do with it. So I think for the nonprofits is being able to build the capacity so that when resources are available, to be able to deploy them in ways that are equitable. And so one of the things that we do at DIRTB is that we really emphasize that conversations around like wellness need to be collective. They can't be top down. So actually, like if we in an application, it's really clear that the executive director is going to be deciding like, okay, everybody's going to have a spa day and then we're going to do this and you're going to get a Friday off and that's how we're going to use the grant. That's not a competitive grant. So I think that also cultivating a capacity for collectively taking care of ourselves, even if there isn't the availability of a grant, is something that could be done. And then create a readiness for funders to also recognize sometimes our grantees need permission to take a break. I know that one of our colleagues here in California, I think it was like Roy and Disney, they just bought out a coffee shop for a day and just invited their grantees to just come and hang out, right? And so I think like just creating readiness on both sides for when there are opportunities for taking care of each other.
I love that example, Maria. I think there's been so many great examples. I will say this idea of decentralized decision-making among staff was one of the elements of wellness that came up in our report, which I think was really important for staff to feel like they had spaces to make decisions within the organization. They may not be deciding ultimately on the final budget, but if they had certain areas, programmatic areas, informing budgets, that supported their well-being in being part of the organization. I did want to shift to that last thought, Maria, around just that permission area and what Rusty likes to do on silo busting. So Rusty, this is your silo busting moment, but I wanted to raise this statistic, this data point from the Center for Effective Philanthropy, CEP's 2026 report about the sector in crisis around this maybe misunderstanding between funders and nonprofits. They found that 93% of funders think foundations have been successful in understanding grantees' challenges, while only 54% of nonprofits believe foundations understand their challenges. And that's a 41% gap in perception. So what are your guidance for this group that has been through this and built trust? What are the things that you might offer before we open it up for Q&A to the audience? Start with Janelle as you're thinking about misunderstanding. And I just want everyone to appreciate Janelle's bravery to be on this call and just share so much of what this experience is of leading an organization and recognize there are power dynamics across sharing these things, but offering, if that resonates for you, this gap in understanding, do foundations understand their grantees?
Yes and no. I think it depends on, I'm thinking of some of my funding partners who I've known them. I can be really authentic with them. I can share my worries. And then there are others where I'm a little more buttoned up. And I imagine as funders, foundations want to know about the impact on the client or the community, right? Those outcomes. Whereas I'm concerned with my people. But no funder asks me about turnover or health insurance or the ratio, a difference between my lowest paid employee and highest paid employee. But those are things that I care about. I also have the luxury of being a mid-sized organization and having a robust staff. So I can learn about all of these things. I think about the smaller organizations that are just going day to day. They might not know some of these sort of fundamental core elements of taking care of your people. So I think that the gap might be on where we are focusing our attention, on whom, clients or staff, and maybe something like S.O.S funding would really shift that dialogue and bring that all to light.
Thank you, Janelle. Maria or Kim, any thoughts?
I think for me, I'm just astounded that donors would think that they know their nonprofit partners that well. I mean, our board meets 3 times a year, and as staff, I think there's just this observation that how do you know what staff are going through if you just sit with them 3 times a year and read a board docket beforehand? And I would say I feel exactly the same thing about our grantees, right? Like they're putting on their best show for us when we see them, which I love, right? Like when we visit, it's amazing and it's so insightful. But how could we possibly really understand them if we see them at best 3 times a year, right? And especially some of the ones that are outside of the US, I'm like, I've never even been to your country. How could I possibly understand what you're going through? That is so condescending to actually even think that way. I think there's the reality of saying we're on a journey together and we will learn with you, and we have to be curious, and we have to just understand the limitations of what we do and don't know and accept that and move forward together. But it's a journey and it has to be rooted in curiosity, I think.
Kim said very much what I was thinking. When I first entered philanthropy, I probably would have answered and said yes, because I had just come out of community. And as I've spent more time in philanthropy, I do feel like, gosh, I really just don't understand what's happening on the ground anymore. Even though we are in conversation and we have cohorts, so we are in deep conversation with folks, but I really do feel like we are disconnected. I think that in philanthropy, you just have to come to terms with like, we really aren't going to know what's really happening. And we're going to need to make time for that. Spend more time out meeting with folks. They might get scared at first, like, why does Lydia want to have lunch with me? Well, when I check in, and then they'll understand, like, oh, she just kind of wants to know what's going on.
And then they'll feel better next time you ask for lunch or their friends get asked to lunch. So appreciate that so much. And I think that's just such wonderful reflections from this group. I think it's a very interesting statistic. I'd be curious on the sample of who answered that, Rusty, and putting that in there and what was kind of maybe more behind that question too. But I think it is this opportunity to say both funders and nonprofits, and I would put government funders in there as well, to really take a moment to listen to each other and not assume that necessarily you live their lives every day. And I'd say the same thing for nonprofit leaders. They don't always know everything a program officer might be managing and helping to support them as well. But I know we want to take questions from the audience before we ask this panel to give a final thought. And so if anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question, Piper from Ralph and Parsons Foundation would love to invite you in.
Yeah, thank you. This has been so great. We do lots of general operating support at the Parsons Foundation, and we've started doing these like little talent investment grants. And one thing we found, even by just doing these smaller, like $15,000 investments, is of course, that means that's less general operating support grants and like less grants in general, right? It's always the seesaw. And so I totally agree with lifting this up and really advocating for this, but it's like, I feel like we're up against that. Okay, that's great. We'll give, I guess, a general operating support and a staff support grant. That means somebody else is not getting a grant though. So just, yeah, I would love to hear any thoughts on kind of from that side.
So I feel like this is an interesting point because humans are capital. And I think what intrigues me about S.O.S funding is It's restricted, unrestricted. I don't have to say I'm doing something new. I don't have to say I'm bringing something on or I'm expanding. It is just for us to be as we are and to fund it ongoing. And I think that to me feels very different than another grant. And I hear it's a pie, right? And there's only so much pie to go around. And you all have tough jobs. I have a tough job, but you all have really tough jobs too. And Piper, I think coming back to you have a process. The best funding relationships I have are when the funders' goals align with the work I'm doing. And so really being true to that and being authentic about what that is, I think is really important.
Thank you, Janelle. I know we're running against time. We have 3 more minutes before this officially ends. And a big takeaway from this is it doesn't have to be an S.O.S. grant. It's a tool, I think I'm hearing, Rusty. If within a current grant, we could do more to make sure staff are paid adequately, whether that's a restricted grant or a GOS grant, like the overall goal is to make sure that there's more wellness with the staff. So I wanted to give everyone a chance to maybe say the final 2 thoughts as folks are hopping off.
In terms of response, I mean, I know there's a continuum, right, of investing, of how funders can invest in grantee staff. And we've been so far, the majority of funders are giving restricted project support, I think. That's my read of the field. I mean, there's a lot of folks who want to and are moving more toward Gen Op. The idea is that we know you have a pie that's not going to expand as a funder. How do you take that pie and put more of it into staffing costs at nonprofits? Imagine your household budget was 90%, I don't know, education, right? For your kids are in college or something. And your funder who's funding your employer says, I'm restricting my money to you to furniture. And you say, that's great. I love furniture. I'd love to have more and more great furniture. But my biggest expense is my kid going to college. So now I have to kind of like, yeah, I bought a new couch. But really, it was going to the kid's couch at college, which was really the dorm expense. So why do we keep saying furniture when the biggest expense is education? So what I'm saying is instead of giving project support, give staff operating support, the same dollars. And if you want to fund a program, great. Give a supplemental mini grant for that program because it's 5% of the organization's budget, not 95%, which is salary, benefits, and contracts. So what I'm saying is we need to swing. We need more funders to move on the continuum from this project support towards staff operating support. For those who are like, but we give general support, that's what everyone wants. That's great. Then incentivize it. Say, this is general support, and we encourage you to use it for your staff needs, salaries, benefits. That is not off limits. Please do that. It is not taboo. We encourage it. If you can give that signal, that might be enough for that general support to then get used. A big part of this is about incentive and signal and the stuff that's not said. And if funders can start saying, we care about you as human beings and as a team, and not just you, Annie, but the team and the salaries and the policies and practices that support Annie and everyone else, then we're getting somewhere. So I don't really care in the end of the day if it's restricted or unrestricted, as long as it provides the money and the incentives to support the staff and the people systems. So I'm willing to change the idea that it has to be restricted, but I think it should be dedicated, or at least the intention should be there to support the people.
Ultimate flexibility. Yeah.
Follow the leader who's on the ground doing the work. I love it. Maria, Kim, Janelle, this was so nice to share this space and everyone that's online listening too. We covered a lot, and it'll be really interesting as folks take these ideas and quote them and put them into practice. You guys offered so much in examples. So thank you. Thanks for having me, Rusty.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, panelists and Annie and everyone who came. Thanks for listening to Fund the People podcast. Visit fundthepeople.org and click on podcast to find a transcript for this and other episodes and all the links discussed in the episode. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate a 5-star rating and a quick review if possible on Apple Podcasts. It helps more people to find the show. Thank you for driving change in our communities. Remember to keep your tank full. Take care of yourself and take care of one another.